Welcome, ye land lovers and sea dwellers, and those with a song in their heart singing sea shanties of love, life, and laughter. Welcome to the Modern Romantic Podcast, where we also sing in the delights of romanticism and those who celebrate in it. I am the Dread Pirate Trey, and I am joined, as always, by Emily Montoya. Prepare to die. Hi, welcome.
That was amazing. Thank you.
As a Clueder audience, literally at time of recording, I was given a challenge to give more za to this introduction, which we'll find out what that means in a little bit. But that was my take on giving our introduction more za. How has your week been, Emily?
It's been great. I've been very excited to talk to our guest. We've had him scheduled for a little bit here, and when I heard what he did, I was very excited to have him on the show. So I haven't been practicing any kind of sword play over the last week, but I kind of wish I had.
So we could do more like fake sword noises, sword noises, sword
So just
noises,
yeah, I can like
sword noises, which is a major callback to one of our first episodes on the podcast. That's a deep, deep, deep cut.
oh, it is. You're right. About the deepest cut you could probably make with the podcast.
Probably. But if you go back far enough, you can watch our first episode, Romeo and Juliet, a completely unscripted reading of Romeo and Juliet. It's great. We love it. But yeah, super deep cut to that.
It's an unscripted script reading.
An unscripted script reading. Unrehearsed script reading.
Yes, unrehearsed is correct.
Very. It was great. But yeah, you will probably have guessed that we've used a lot of pirate puns in this opening here, but it's for a good reason, and that is because we have an amazing guest with us today. So, Emily, would you please do us the honor and introduce our guest?
Absolutely. We have with us today a swashbuckler, a musician, and an author, all in one. Sebastien DeCastell is here with us today, and I was really excited to talk to you. And welcome to the show. I can't tell you how excited I was that we get to talk to a swashbuckler.
Thanks to you both for having me on. I'm not sure I can really take the mantle of swashbuckler. One of the funny things about fantasy authors is that the number of the Venn diagram of fantasy authors and people who still fight with swords into their old age is quite remarkable in terms of its overlap. So I was just in Toronto hanging out with a good friend of mine, Christian Cameron, who also writes as Miles Cameron. He's a well-known historical adventure author and fantasy author, and he's such a genuine swashbuckler, as in sword fights, almost every day, and goes on these reenactments and goes camping in the medieval style in the wilderness sometimes. That he makes me feel inadequate as a swashbuckler. He gives me imposter syndrome.
That's quite immersive.
Yeah. But I will try to be sufficiently swashbuckly for the next hour or so. I will at various points threaten to duel one or both of you.
I accept this challenge. And when do we fight?
Is there a proper way to do this? Is there a proper way to do this? How do you challenge someone to a duel?
Well, there's lots of ways. I mean, if Trey were here, I would, obviously find a really nice glove and slap him as hard as I could with it. I'd most likely fill it with quarters first, because if you can take someone out just with the challenge, then you can skip the duel entirely. It's funny. There was really never an era in which dueling was all that common. Like, it did sort of happen, but the whole notion of the formal duel at dawn with the seconds, was almost always illegal. There were very few periods of time where it was widespread. And there were always rules about, you really couldn't generally duel someone of a different social class, for example, or in the military, you couldn't duel someone who was an officer if you weren't an officer. And in times of actual war, you weren't allowed to do any dueling because they really needed you, to die a different way. Not over a question of whether someone cheated at cards or not. Um,
Right.
yeah, it's funny how things like dueling are so kind of ingrained in the Western consciousness. In the same way that swords are in swordplay. When the sword, at no point in history was the sword ever the primary military weapon. For example. It was
Oh.
spears and pikes, and then rifles. Sort of every different kind of weapon. But swords somehow are the one that always sticks in their imagination.
Real quick, I hate to interrupt. I'm having an audio issue suddenly. Trey, does everything sound normal to you?
It is starting to sound a little muffled.
Yeah, it's on your end, Sebastian, I think. It
That's
might be
strange.
fine.
I got my beautiful
That's clear.
special magic mic.
We're good. Maybe it was
Yeah.
it was like starting to, maybe it was a connection issue. We're fine. It's
Yeah.
good.
Okay.
All good.
I'm going to write this down so I can take care of editing that out later. Okay. It's interesting because the movies and TV shows and books all romanticize it, and you don't necessarily realize that it was probably illegal, and that's the same as like meeting somebody out back, as it would be today. Like you can get charged with assault.
Yeah,
And
no,
battery.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no, there isn't really legally speaking, there isn't a sort of a notion of a consensual brawl. You go to well, it's okay, officer, because we both agreed we were going to get into a drunken bar fight. But oddly, you read cases where, even though it's not enshrined as any type of legal protection, you see cases where police officers or even judges or prosecutors almost treat it that way. In other words, that notion of dueling as having some kind of honor attached to it is something that's kind of still seems like it pervades, different segments of society. And again, as I say, as somebody who writes swashbuckling fantasy novels full of swordplay and duels, that's very helpful to me. Possibly less helpful to society as a whole,
though. What I was fascinated by, like reading your bio and reading where some of the books came from, was that you were, as far as I understand, inspired by a 6-hour wait for a ferry. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was about 16, I was off camping by myself on one of the islands off the coast of British Columbia here in Canada, and I found myself in a state of existential crisis, as one goes through quite often at the age of 16. And I was waiting for a ferry, and I was late for the early ferry, which meant I had to wait another 6 hours to get a ferry that was going to take me to the next island. And I'd happened upon a book on one of those, spinning shelves that you'd find in small shops periodically. And it was called Bard by Keith Taylor, who's an Australian author and a great writer and just a wonderful guy. He's still around. He's still writing. I'm hoping he's going to write another one of his Bard books. But yeah, this was this was called Bard, just 4 letters on the title of the book. And it was about this 8th century Irish minstrel who spent his life traveling the world and getting into sword fights and telling stories and playing songs and music. And I just read that book cover to cover, waiting for a ferry, and went, that's it. That's the career for me. Unfortunately, there are very few help wanted ads for bards. And so I ended up, just over the kind of decades of my life, finding different ways to do that, which included things like, I worked as a traveling musician for several years. It was, I made my living going from one small town to another in a rock band, playing Brown Eyed Girl 3 times a night. I choreographed sword fights for the theater. I did all kinds of different career paths, which in the aggregate kind of all let me experience a little bit of that life, that adventure that I really craved so much as a young romantic. And which all culminated, about 10 years ago when my first fantasy novel was published. And then that was part of a 4-book deal and led to an 8-book deal, which led to another 4-book deal and a 2-book deal and a 3-book deal. And it sort of just keeps going on from there. So So yeah, I've had 17 novels published in the last 10 years or so. So it's been quite an adventure, all thanks to Keith Taylor and his book about swashbuckling bards.
That is incredible. And I swore I wasn't going to ask this question, but I am going to ask this in a slightly different way. Where do you feel like you draw your inspiration from? You've talked about swashbucklers, you've talked about the almost romanticization of the pirates themselves or swashbucklers, but I mean, I feel like there's more to that story than just that. Where do you feel like that inspiration comes from?
For sure. So there's a lot of different sources of inspiration, depending on the writer, even for, in the genre that we think of as fantasy, and then even narrower, those of us that write, I think of myself as writing swashbuckling fantasy predominantly, even though oddly I don't really tend to write about pirates. But one example is just anything that is fascinating historically that you then want to pull from and adapt into a fantasy world. So, for example, a long while ago, I came across some references to what were called the Justices Itinerant of 12th century England. So this is in the time, I think, of King John, I guess it would be. Sorry, my English history is not up to snuff. But the Justices Itinerant came out of a time where when people talked about the court, they meant the king's court, because that was the only court there was. There wasn't like a system of courtrooms in every small town inside England, for example. And so in order to have any kind of a functioning legal system that wasn't just entirely controlled either by individual communities or by the local baron, they had to have these justices itinerant who would go on a circuit for 6 months. They would travel on horseback from town to town, and they come into town, and people would say, all right, well, I have a complaint against this person killed my dog, or this person stole my land, or this person murdered me, and and I'm a ghost, come back. That last one probably didn't happen that often, but we can always hope. And these justices itinerant would have to hear the cases. And so, sometimes you'd have something happen in a town, you'd have a dispute with someone, and it couldn't be heard for 6 months until the justice came around. And that, of course, is where we get the term circuit court, which is still used today in the United States, for example. And actually, there are tales, perhaps apocryphal, but they seem genuine, that Abraham Lincoln was a circuit court lawyer who would travel from town to town with another lawyer and a judge, and they'd get into town. There'd be a case. The judge would say, okay, Lincoln, you handle this case, and other guy, you handle this side of the case. One of the prosecutor, one's the defense, or one's for one plaintiff, the other for the other. And there's also stories that apparently sometimes when they didn't need two advocates, the judge would go fishing and tell Abraham Lincoln to be the judge. So that kind of an idea to me is so interesting, because it just sparks all kinds of ideas. Like, what happened when a case had to wait too long, and what happened when an itinerant justice arrives in a town where they're going to hear a case where one side might be a local worker or farmhand, and the other side might be the son of the local baron. How do you rule against the baron's son, and what happens when you do? And so that kind of led me to create what were called the Greatcoats, which were these traveling justices in a fantasy country called Tristia, who would often have to duel in order to enforce their own verdicts. And so that allowed me to kind of expand on that and build out a much richer world. And the beautiful thing about fantasy is you can build worlds that are much more thematically driven, rather than, when you're writing historical adventure, you really need as much as possible to stay within the bounds of what's historically viable. But for example, in Tristia, I was able to develop a kind of a country with a very rich dueling culture, and where notions of trial by combat were much, much more elaborate than in our own world. There's 7 different kinds of judicial duels, ranging from, the classic sort of duel over who's right and who's wrong, to sentencing duels, where every cut scored by the prosecutor adds another year to a defendant's sentence, but every cut scored against the prosecutor by the defendant's champion removes a year from their sentence. And so you get all these wonderful extrapolations, and that's really part of the joy of fantasy. So that's one major area where the ideas come from for me.
Wow. I find that so fascinating. As somebody who went into school and I didn't have such an appreciation for historical relevance, hearing that gives a lot of context for poking at ideas and going, what if? Or poking at that and kind of exploring, I don't know, that thread of Philip Pullman of just going, okay, if we pluck the string out of this a little bit and explore what the world inside of this string looks like, I love that as a concept.
I think that's really where it sort of all emerges, and it's not always, a particular factual detail as it is with the Justices Itinerant, for example. For me, the Greatcoats came from three different places. The first was the Justices Itinerant. The second was my older brother, one year when I was in my early 20s, I think, bought me this very long coat for Christmas. It was like a greatcoat. And I was like, what in the world would I ever do with this thing? Like, it's a weirdly, not quite anachronistic, but overly formal kind of garment. Because it's so big and it's got giant pockets in it. And I was working as a terrible actor for a while. And I would always end up on night shoots on these sort of indie films and things like that. And so you're going to be in costume in one sense or another, and then in between takes or when you're not needed, you can't really change all your clothes, and most things, if you put them on, are going to get in the way. But this giant greatcoat you could just put on, and I was instantly at the right temperature, and had all these giant pockets, like I could fit a laptop inside this thing. And so I had this idea: wouldn't it be amazing to have a coat that you could travel anywhere in the world with? And you could camp with, go. In dangerous parts of the world, and always kind of be protected because it had everything you needed with it and inside of it. And so that's why the greatcoats are called the greatcoats, because technically they're supposed to be the king's traveling magistrates, but they wear these long protective garments that kind of serve as armor and a source of weapons and traps and tricks and the things that they need. And then the third element for me of writing, separate from discovering interesting historical details or personal experiences, is just thematic elements. So, for example, I did promise we'd get into politics somehow.
That's what we're here for.
Back in 2004, the U.S. election, Canada's a very, very polite and civilized country, which means that our politics are generally quite boring. Whereas you guys have some really fabulously entertaining politics.
We like to stir it up.
Exactly. And so one of the things I was struck by at the time, as a foreigner, as someone who has no say in those politics, was in the election of George Bush versus John Kerry. It was so weird and fascinating for me to watch, as John Kerry had for so long been perceived as a war hero, and he fought in Vietnam, even though he didn't support the war, and he'd gotten the Silver Star and all these kind of things. And then all of a sudden an election happens and people come out, and then suddenly he's presented as the villain, as the coward, whereas George Bush, who was in the Texas Air National Guard, and there had been questions at the time about that service, was more like the patriotic hero. And one of the things that really inspires, I think, a lot of novelists is when there's a gap between what you're seeing in the world and how you process it internally. So for me, that confusion became a kind of a source of wonder. And so that's why when Trader's Blade, which was my debut novel, when that novel begins, the Greatcoats, who were these guys who really thought they were heroes, they were going out in the countryside, risking their lives to bring some semblance of law and justice to the common folk, are completely despised. They're viewed as traitors. The king that had created the order was beheaded and branded a traitor. They were disbanded. They were all referred to as cowards from then on. They're called Tratari, which means tatter cloak, in reference to their coats. And so those elements, regardless of what position anyone takes on a political subject, that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance, is such a great place to mine for telling stories. And I honestly don't think, if I just took the swashbuckling stuff and the historical elements and all of that without some of those themes that probably half my readers might not even agree with my position on personally, if they knew what my position was. But if I left all that out, I think the book, the writing just wouldn't have the same depth. Like, we always have to be touching on something very human, very of the moment, and that's what I love about, especially writing fantasy, is that whatever those themes are that are troubling you as an individual, you kind of get to explore them and turn them into, a story that can be full of adventure and magic and swordplay, even though at some level it's about, what does it mean when people want to be heroes and later on discover that maybe they're not really heroes at all. And for me, the Great Coats was very much an exploration of the question. I'm an idealist by nature. I'm very old school liberal. Do you keep hanging on to your ideals when it looks like they don't work at all? And I think that's something we live with today. A lot of different people on different sides of the political spectrum will look at the world and say, it doesn't look like my ideals work at all. What am I supposed to do with that? And so as a novelist, I get to explore that in a novel, and then, people pay me for it. So.
And you might as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's some of what you said harkens back to one of our episodes we had with Dr. Craig Smith, who is a presidential speechwriter that wrote a book about the romanticism of politics and romanticism in general. So we had him on the show, and without talking about modern politics, we were able to talk about this, and it was really a cool episode, and it makes me think maybe we should have him back sometime. But it is like that, where he was explaining how when things like elections happen, there are things that are romanticized and things that are played up and played down, and they hire people to do that. And so I kind of like that there's that added dimension and depth to your stories as well, and that would, like you said, the human side of it, but also like that feels authentic.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately, we're all constantly engaged in a bit of a search for something that feels authentic. Ever since the Enlightenment, we've all been sort of reacting. In some ways, romanticism is a reaction to the Enlightenment. That the more we understand the world on one level, and I think people encounter this a lot, when they sort of look at the world through the scientific lens, it all makes sense and it all works, which is fabulous and wonderful and magical and all those things. But sometimes it leaves us sort of a gap for sort of the numinous, for want of a better term. And so we're all looking for that. And I agree. I think politics is absolutely, I'm not an especially political writer, but politics is a very romantic endeavor. Democracy is a tremendous romantic leap of faith. You have to fundamentally believe that when the majority of your fellow citizens vote in a way that you don't, that somehow they're right and you're wrong. Like, it's quite a leap of faith to give. It's one that I don't think we're always affording our fellow citizens as much as we probably should. But yeah, I mean, democracy is a very romantic experiment.
It is. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people don't step back and try to look at it that way, but I agree. So I'm sorry, Trey, did you have
I did. It's so clear that you have like a very good pinpoint on the human experience. And with your explanation of the development for your world and how these greatcoats work and operate, I'm curious, like, what does the tome of your world look like? Famously, Tolkien would keep tomes of like written language of the elves, or how the political system would work. So I'm curious, one, how big is your tome? And two, how often do you reference it?
Well, it's funny you say that. I mean, it's such a great question, because I really find more and more these days, and one of the joys of being an author is you get to meet so many other authors. I go to conventions and conferences and things like that. A lot of my close friends have become authors over the years, and there's there's sort of two approaches in that sense. And people often talk about plotters and pantsers, but there's also what I think of as sort of the world builders and the kind of drunken explorers, of which I put myself firmly in the latter category. So Tolkien, of course, is a fabulous example of someone for whom, he would write entire languages of which only a few lines end up in a book. A friend of mine, I always call him a friend of mine, even though we've only hung out a couple of times, Adrian Tchaikovsky, who's a terrific science fiction and fantasy novelist. We've been on panels together once or twice, and he'll talk about, that he started out by building an entire world, based on a really fascinating idea, because, to do with insects and the way that we perceive insects and insect characteristics. And he wanted to kind of reverse that revulsion that so many people tend to have and turn it into an admiration. He builds out this incredible world with maps and the dynamics of everything, and cultures and histories and religions and all that sort of stuff. And then decides what stories will fit well inside of that world. I work the complete other way. I start metaphorically speaking, I start with a character in a dark cave with a flashlight, and I only build as much world as appears in the beam of that flashlight. So, for example, with the Greatcoats, I began with was a notion of, okay, there's these king's traveling magistrates. They're called the Greatcoats. Now the king's dead. Everything's fallen apart. Everyone hates them. They've fallen on hard times. Falkio is my main character, someone who desperately wanted to be a hero from a very young age. He wanted to be a greatcoat because he thought that was the most heroic thing you could do. And now he's, in his 30s and basically disgraced and forced to work as a bodyguard for, not especially noble, so to speak. But working for a merchant, and that's sort of what I start with. And then I go, okay, well, what would make that world even harder for him? And so I end up with things like, well, everybody loves knights, knights in armor, even though the knights are brutes and thugs. And I like the idea that he despises the notion of honor, because honor in the world of Tristia is understood as obeying your oath, obeying your lord, right? If your lord says, do this, the honorable thing is that you do it. And so if your lord says, go burn this village, you burn the village, because that's, your honor compels it. And so I could build this world where a lot of the values that actually people were grabbing onto were ones that were completely opposed to my main character. And it would just sort of continue that way all the way along. There's, the dukes are these sort of very powerful nobles, the ones who deposed and then executed the king. And so that you have these duchies, and then I sort of was interested in the idea of the tension, which is very traditional, between the sort of the more local baron type lords and the notion of a kingdom. So, in fact, both in your country and mine, I'm assuming you're both in the States. Sorry,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There's always the tension in the US between states' rights and the federal government. And in some ways, even more so here in Canada, where we have federalism, but our provinces and territories sometimes will say, no, we're the ones that are the real government. The federation is just a loose, sort of connection. And so I wanted to turn that into a kind of a constant power grab between these various duchies. And so that's how I tend to build. So in terms of the question of the tome of Tristia, in the case of the Greatcoats, is the 4 books. For me, there's nothing is real other than the text itself, right? So I can have all, and this is something I think is really important for writers to remember. I can tell you I have this character, and I can have all these visions of this character and all these characteristics and all these things that make them interesting and conflicted and wonderful and compelling, and you should really love them. But if they're not actually in the text, they don't exist, right? Everything else is just in my head, and that does no good at all. Mm-hmm. The job of the text is to do the best job possible of creating a kind of a narrative garden in which the reader kind of grows the characters in their minds, right? If you think of a dragon in a book, is never described at the level of detail that the reader sees it. The reader creates the rest of it. And so if I get too obsessed about my vision of what the dragon looks like and exactly how long it is and the shapes of the scales and the exact color and things like that, then all I'm really doing is creating an even greater distance between myself and the reader. And so for me, it's always been about the text. In fact, it's one of the hardest parts when you're writing, another series inside the same world, is I have to make sure that I don't screw things up. Because for me, the instinct is always to ask, what is the most dramatic next thing that can happen? Not what was the eye color of this character and how short was their hair.
Right.
But the problem, of course, is if you screw up the eye color and the hair, which I'm sure I've done at some point in my career, then for some reason, readers, that pulls them out of the story. And so for me, it's like when people talk about authenticity in terms of, let's say, swordplay, right? So I remember when I was writing Traitor's Blade, I was very intentional when I wrote Traitor's Blade to make sure that not one sword maneuver or technique was ever grounded in historical reality. Because I knew way too many people in the sort of historical European martial arts community who I just knew, like, you could take any one completely concrete factual thing and there'll be someone else in the community who goes, that's not true. That wasn't how they did it. And so I didn't want to deal with that at all. So for me, authenticity is always really about that sense of human experience and human drama inside of the context of a swashbuckling fantasy story or a young adult fantasy series like Spellslinger, or an irreverent dark fantasy like Malevolent 7. In all those books, the authenticity I care about is really that it should feel human. It should feel like this is what people would do, so that we can connect with those characters. And so, yeah, I have tremendous admiration for the people who can tell you, here's my tome for this world and here's my tome for this world. I've just never been one of those people.
I feel like that's valid, though, and there's
Sure.
no wrong and there's no right way to do it. For me as a person, I think about how expansive some of those ideas can get. And so I tend to worry about, did I forget the eye color? Did I forget the hair color? Or did I forget what socioeconomic group was going through the hardship 50 years ago? And be able to reference that in this very specific conversation. But at some point, I recognize your point. At some point, it doesn't really impact the story that I'm currently telling. It's more about the human connection that is happening from the text currently on that page.
Yeah, and I think it's funny. I think the one place where you always have to be cautious as a writer is where you're writing about a character, even inside of a fantasy world or a group, where for some people it will feel obvious that you are referring or fantasizing in some way a group from our own world. That if that's happening, you have to be as credible as possible about how you're writing about their experience. So if you're writing about, for example, it's inevitable if you're writing a lot of books or with a lot of characters, you're going to have a character who has some form of physical impairment that they're dealing with. And if when that happens, you have to be cautious about making sure that you're not, that you're not perceived as commenting about people in our world who might have that impairment in a way that is demeaning to them, which is more and more a challenge with fiction as our lens on what kind of fiction we write and who is written about grows, which is one of the benefits of the last 25 years, is that there's a lot more emphasis on growing the circle of who is written about and who is writing. But it does require us to be sort of careful about that. Whereas when it comes to things like, a fantasy religion, for example, where often it's not going to be very closely based on a religion in our world. So it's unlikely that you're writing about something that practitioners of a religion, living today are going to see as commenting on them. I don't worry about it very much at all, because it's very unlikely that I'm going to do that. It's very unlikely that someone's going to go, oh, the saints that he's got in Saint's Blood, the Saint of Swords and the Saint of this. I think he's really talking about, Saint, Hubert or something, and insulting my religion. So that's for me is the thing is giving myself as much freedom as possible in the spaces where I can be free as a writer. Because there are inevitably going to be some aspects of the writing where I have to be more cautious about recognizing that what I'm writing, even though it's fiction, can sometimes be perceived as commenting on things that are real and people that have real experiences.
That is incredibly valid.
Do you have what was I trying to ask here? Like, obviously, when you write, these are stories that you're writing that are in worlds that you want to put yourself into yourself mentally. I presume authors do this. Like, I'm not going to write a book about a world I don't want to be in mentally, right? There are difficult, probably, parts of that world that you deal with to tell your story. Do you have any of those?
Well, it's funny. It's funny because I'm not 100% sure whether or not, I really don't know the answer, whether or not I agree with the premise entirely. Because, for example,
Okay.
if you think of, I think it's less writing about places you want to be. So I don't write very many books set in the French Riviera,
Okay.
even though I would like to spend more time there.
Sure.
But for example, Slumdog Millionaire, most of us don't go, yeah, I really want to grow up in the toughest parts of the slums of
That's true.
Delhi. But what does draw us, I think, if you think again of that movie as an example, is that even amidst poverty and hardship, you see this kind of strange beauty, or this unexpected beauty for those who aren't part of that world, and you start to see that there's all of this kind of beautiful humanity, even in places that we might not want to live in ourselves. When people write post-apocalyptic fiction, which is tremendously popular, it's not that anyone wants to live in a post-apocalyptic world that's overrun with zombies and doesn't have much clean drinking water. It's that there are experiences that we can imagine in that setting that we can't imagine, in the French Riviera or in the canals of Venice or things like that. And so that's often what draws us, is to ask, well, what would that be like? Where would the sources of beauty be? Or, interestingly, if you're writing about a really beautiful place, so a lot of mystery writers will take a setting like Venice, where for a lot of us, we imagine it as this sort of endlessly beautiful canal-ridden paradise. And they'll find the dark and seedy parts of it to write about. And so it's exploring, I think, that drives it for me. It's always about, I want to explore what's going on there. So, for example, Malevolent 7, which is the book that came out in 2 years ago and was an unexpected hit. I had not written that book for anyone to read. Oddly, it was.
Wow.
I had just come off of a 6-book young adult fantasy series in which, and I loved my editors and I loved my publishers, but inevitably the language was becoming more and more policed, because that's the cultural context that we're in now, where we get much more concerned about how different words and ideas might negatively affect other people. And that can be very, very constraining for a novelist. It can start to feel like you're just being put in a cage, even when people write wonderful things about your books. So Spellslinger is notable for having a talking squirrel cat, who's the sort of companion of this young spellslinger named Kellen. And Rikus, the squirrel cat, is this murderous, thieving sort of animal, very small squirrel cat who thinks he's the apex of the animal kingdom. He thinks of himself as the apex predator. So he's always threatening to murder everything. And so everybody loves Rikus. And it's great that they like Rikus, but then you see people writing letters. They'll write me letters going, if you ever kill Rikus, I will, come find you. And they'll be like, please, can this character do this? Never change this about this character. Never do this thing. And it becomes so kind of embedded in your skull that it can be very it can affect you adversely as a writer. And so in 2020, I think it was February of 2020, right when the pandemic was starting to cause travel to shut down and things like that, I decided I was going to take a month just to write a book for myself. It was going to be sort of a palate cleanser book. I was just going to write every day. I was going to write a book. I was going to have all kinds of crazy magic in it and that I was never going to explain. And I was going to have terrible anti-hero characters, and I was going to use all the bad words I could possibly think of and all of that. And I realized it's only after you write the book that you understand what you're really writing about. And I realized that I wanted to explore a world in which almost everybody, for one reason or another, had decided that they were the bad guys. That they, because they had done some bad things in their lives, that they were not worthwhile as human beings, and therefore, and this is the key part, therefore had no responsibility towards their fellow human beings. And that was because I was starting to feel like we were gradually sliding into a kind of a cultural period where we split each other into good people and bad people. And the definition of a bad person is anyone who's ever done anything bad. And the definition of a good person is someone who's never done anything bad. Not that they have to have done good things, they just have to have never done bad things. And it doesn't matter how many good things a bad person does, because if you've done the one bad thing, then you're a bad person. And my problem with that is not so much the judgment, which is what everybody else was talking about. Oh, we're wrecking people's careers and stuff, which is undoubtedly sometimes true. But my fear is what happens when we convince other people successfully that they are bad people, and they say, okay, well, I guess I don't have any responsibility towards anyone else because I'm a piece of crap. And so Malevolent 7 is about a character named Cade Ombra, who is a mercenary war mage, or wondrist, as they're called in that world, who used to be a kind of what was called a Glorian Justiciar, working for ostensibly the auroral forces, the good guys, except they turn out to not be very good. And he's kind of convinced that he's a piece of garbage at this point, and all of the people he's with, these other kind of gunslinger mages, they've also done bad things, and they run into a situation where the heroes aren't coming and humanity's going to fall apart. And so if they don't step up and somehow try to be the heroes that they're not remotely qualified to be, but if they don't somehow do it, then everything's going to fall apart. And that for me is what I needed to explore at that particular moment in time, right? I needed to create a world where I could explore what happens when we're constantly telling each other that we're bad people and we start to believe it.
It's like you have the quote on the cover of the Malevolent 8. They may be heroes, but they'll never be the good guys.
Yeah, exactly. Malevolent 8 was tremendously strange and fun to write. So Malevolent 8 is a sequel. So as I said, originally Malevolent 7 was just, I was writing for me. It wasn't going to be,
right.
Or I wasn't going to publish it. And I sent my agent at the time had asked me what I was working on, and I mentioned it, and I said, but it's not for publication. And she said, well, let me read it anyway. So I sent it to her, and she got back to me a couple of days later and said, oh, I love this. We should sell it. And I said, no, forget it. This is terrible. It'll be the end of my career. And then she retired. So she retired to go do a master's in history at Oxford. And my new agent said, oh, I've heard about this manuscript, Malevolent 7. Can I take a look? And I said, sure, but it's not for publication. And so he got back to me 3 days later. And he said, I love this. We should sell it. And he kept kind of bugging me about it. And eventually I said, fine, you can try. No one's going to buy this. And it was the fastest sale I'd ever made on a book.
Wow.
It was hilarious. And so, but it was meant, even though I knew what a trilogy would look like in that world, it was published originally as a standalone, but then it ended up being much more successful than any of us expected. And so my publisher said, well, we want, 2 sequels. And they said, and my agent said, so you have to write a pitch. And I said, why do I have to write a pitch when they already want a sequel? And they want a sequel because the first book was a hit. And he said, well, that's just the way it is, but you take as long as you want. And I said, forget it. I got off the phone and I'm going to write this pitch in an hour, and they're going to get what they get. And I just wrote the most expensive pitch possible. So typically a pitch is, consists of a synopsis and then a detailed outline, and then 3 sample chapters or something. I just started writing this horrific scene in which angels are being tortured to death on the mortal plane because the auroral and the infernal forces have finally found a way to fight in person by getting onto the mortal plane. And then so these demons are torturing these angels to death. They're called angelics in the book. And the Malevolent Seven shows up, and they kill off all the infernals, the devils. And then the angels are like, this is wonderful. This is proof that the auroral cause is just, and we're going to win. And we're starting by taking over this town and making all the people in it soldiers in our army. And then the Malevolent Seven kill all the angels. And hence when the townsfolk after are going, we thought you were supposed to be the good guys. And they say, we might be the heroes, but we'll never be the good guys. And as I was doing that, I realized, there's only 6 characters after the first book. And I went, well, I need to have a 7th member of the Malevolent Seven, because the Malevolent Six doesn't sound very good. And so I went, screw it, I'm going to put in this character. I just added this line. It was like, and then there's Temper, a 7-foot creature that looks kind of like a rabbit, but with smaller ears and a big long tail that he wraps around the necks of his opponents before punching them to death and then sucking the blood out of the pulp left behind of their face. And they went, yeah, it's a vampire kangaroo. And so I sent this pitch off partly in jest to my agent, who... I literally the last line of the pitch was Malevolent 8, let's get canceled. And I sent this to my agent. I
love that so much.
And my email to my agent was very formal. It was like, Dear John Wood, of RCA Literary, as promised, attached, you'll find the full pitch for Malevolent 8. I believe you'll agree that in form and style, it conforms to the highest standards of a literary pitch. However, if you have any tiny details you'd like me to look at a second time, let me know. Yours truly. And my agent, having the same 15-year-old boy instinct that I seem to have at times, sent it unedited to the publishers.
Awesome.
So who I'd already been kind of fighting with a little bit, over things like covers and stuff, and we weren't sure how they felt about it. And so 3 days later, we just got a 1-sentence reply to this pitch, and it just said, "You had me at vampire kangaroo."
Yeah.
And so I thought that was the funniest thing I've ever gotten. And it just sort of showed me that as much as I think a lot of writers, myself included, sometimes have this anxiety about, whether our culture is becoming censorious or overly restrictive or things like that, that actually there's a certain hunger for irreverence. There's a hunger for naughty jokes or vampire kangaroos sucking the blood out of, their victims, of kind of anti-heroes trying to be the good guys even when they're not supposed to be the good guys. So I think that's out there. I think that what people are actually fighting against, even though it doesn't always feel that way to all of us, is just is people don't want writers, for example, to be actively going out and hurting other communities, right? To be mean-spirited in what they write. And so I just learned so much from that experience. But that came from going, I have these dark thoughts inside of me. It's February 2020. Everything's being locked down. I'm concerned about the way people talk about fantasy online and how censorious the culture is becoming. I'm going to just write whatever the hell I want because I don't have to show it to anyone if I don't like it. And then discovering that, I was actually writing about other things instead. And so, being a fantasy novelist is the single best and most profitable form of personal therapy I've ever encountered.
I was going to ask earlier on, but I think what your explanation to us really answered that question, which was, how do you balance the light with the dark? And it sounds like you are finding those moments to do things just for yourself, that when the constraints of other things happen, you just do something sometimes for yourself and go, I'm going to do it because this is what I want, not what someone else wants from me.
Yeah, I used to work at a place called Vancouver Film School, which is a really wonderful entertainment school. It was wonderful when I was there anyway. I really liked the people. I loved the students. I loved the work that they created. And I was the head of the digital design program for a couple of years. And sometimes people used to say the simplest definition, if someone wants to know the difference between art and design, is design is something you make for other people and art is something you make for yourself. That's not always true, of course, but it is an interesting way to look at it, that art, to be an artist, you have to sometimes make space for creating art that is for you. Because if you try to make art for other people all the time, you start to think in terms of product, which is, a helpful way to think about things sometimes, to think about, you're creating a product for an audience and there's a market and you have to reach them a certain way. But from an artistic standpoint, that can be even more stifling than any kind of censorship you can imagine, because basically you're now telling that inner voice that wants to write about silly things or very dark things or very beautiful things. You're silencing it. When Trader's Blade came out, the big trend inside of fantasy was called grimdark. And grimdark was meant to be incredibly gritty, violent, but in a way authentic fantasy, where it didn't romanticize war, for example. Game of Thrones was one of the big classics of grimdark, and people would say when the TV show came out, because the TV show, of course, started far later than the books, even though it also ended before the books are finished, since the last book isn't finished still.
Yep.
But people would sometimes say, well, this is too violent. There's too much sexual violence. There's too much of this kind of violence. And George R. R. Martin would say, if that's what happens in war. Like, don't, he didn't want to romanticize war the way that we sometimes do. But that trend of just very, very dark fantasy where everybody's horrible and everything that happens is generally pretty horrid, wasn't what I was writing. When Trader's Blade came out in 2014, that was sort of in some ways the height of grimdark. And, there were people who would say, well, who's going to want to read a book that's like the Three Musketeers and meets Westeros, like it's all the camaraderie and the humor and the idealism, but it turned out that there were tons of people that were desperately wanting that. Some people, I think they coined the term charm dark for charming and dark. And so to get to Trey's question, I think you always balance light and dark by being truthful to what you think is true. So, for example, I'm often asked to be on panels about how do you use humor in dark stories, and I always find myself having to remind people humor is part of how human beings deal with hardship. Right? It's part of its function. So is music. So is dance. Right? A lot of the music that we love in the West, in terms of rock and roll music and blues and stuff, comes out of a tradition of enslaved peoples, singing and writing songs and hymnals and all these things, because that was one of the ways you stay alive. You keep your soul alive, and so humor is a tool that we use in dark moments. And so if you stay true to that, it becomes twice as potent, because the reader can feel that sense of authentic desperation in the characters. They're not telling a joke to be funny. They're telling a joke because that's their way of saying, we're in this together. I'm not giving up hope.
It's a connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's funny, because that's why I think I have a certain sympathy for people who really dislike, mean-spirited humor, where people will say, well, I should be allowed to tell whatever joke I want, even if it's, directly hurtful to a particular group of people. I'm one of those people who, believes heavily in freedom of expression, which is what we call it here in Canada, and there's freedom of speech in the US. But I never think that's a great use of humor. If it's sort of meant to target somebody. And I'm not speaking in particular of any comedians. I think Dave Chappelle, I think, is a genius. I absolutely think his humor is brilliant. But I'm always mindful, are you telling the joke because the joke's funny, or are you telling the joke because somebody's pissed you off and now you want to go, you want to make them feel some of that pain back, which is a terrible use of humor. So for me, that's the key. You balance the light and the darkness by having an awareness of why someone is saying something. In the same way, if you're writing a scene between a married couple who's having an argument, and one of them makes a derogatory comment about the appearance of the other, why they're saying that. They're not saying it because, there's a particular necessity to comment on somebody else's appearance. They're saying it because they're hurt and they're trying to hurt the other person back. And so that can feel, in a drama, can feel very credible and authentic. And by the same token, a couple having the worst fight of their marriage, where one of them then says something funny, almost as a joke, that's also an action. That's a way of saying, maybe we've gone too far. Can we find a space to come back to one another? So yeah, I use humor all the time in sometimes books that are very dark in terms of their other themes, just because it just feels real to me.
I think that's a great way to keep the authenticity, and it keeps readers coming back. And it's not... My problem with a lot of other works is that they go so far into a space that it loses the sense of what makes a story even remotely human or remotely relatable. Even if the characters are nowhere close to being humanoid whatsoever, there still needs to be a touch of something recognizable in them that we can connect ourselves back to. So if it's too much fantasy, if it's too dark in something, if it's too much of something, it loses the essence of what we can attach ourselves to.
I agree. And I mean, it's funny you mentioned, like, even if you're writing about, what was it, Ian McEwan? Did Ian McEwan wrote a great book called Nutshell? And Nutshell is a murder mystery from the point of view of a fetus. It's not getting into issues of abortion at all. It's the fetus who's the narrator of the story about the I think the murder of his father, and it's the most odd story you can imagine. But he's a brilliant writer, so it's brilliantly written. Where even though it's a fetus talking, the fetus has to kind of still have be like a person to us in for it to make sense. Even if you're writing, there's lots of books that are written from the standpoint of an animal character, for example. Roger Zelazny's A Night in Lonesome October is written from the point of view of Snuff, the dog of Jack the Ripper, in this kind of bizarre, occult fantasy sort of story. And the book works because we feel for Snuff, and we feel for Snuff not because Snuff is a dog, but because Snuff is a person. You could write a novel written from the standpoint of a robot, of a gecko, of an alien being that looks nothing like human beings. Andy Weir's recent novel, Project Hail Mary, is about an encounter between an astronaut and an alien being who is utterly unlike human beings, but is still a person, right? In that sense of what we mean when we think of a person. And that's such a vital part of writing. You need to always be writing. You don't always have to be writing people, but you have to be writing persons, right? You have to, it doesn't always have to be humans. It doesn't have to be humans like us, but they always have to be persons to us. And that's true even when you're just writing about groups that either the author isn't part of or the reader isn't part of. I'm thinking of Louise Ehrlich's book, The Roundhouse, which is about, in Canada we say Indigenous, I think in the States you still say Native Americans. It's about a group of, a young Native American boy on a reserve dealing with the aftermath of something that happens to his mother. And he's living a life that's, would be very foreign to me, for example. But where you're always, but she finds all these brilliant ways to create these connections. Like the kid in question and his friends are obsessed with Star Trek: The Next Generation. And it sort of reminds you that, just because somebody is from a community different than yours doesn't mean that the cultural artifacts that you adore and feel like they're part of you, they can also feel like they're part of someone else, right? Who lives a completely different life than you. And so, yeah, that's the key. You're always trying to create those connections. You're always trying to write about persons.
I feel like there's a relatability there that that is what I guess that I'm thinking to say that is what is required, but really it's like you can lose your audience if you don't.
Yeah, and you can lose them in all different ways. It's funny. I was thinking of Patrick. I'm going to forget his last name, which is stupid. A very famous book called Perfume. That's about a serial killer called Grenouille, and you really have to. It's a French serial killer who's called Grenouille. You'd have a tough time finding a character that is less appealing to most people. But even there, you know, the author writes in a way that makes you see the suffering of this character, that things don't always go their way, that things can be horrible, that they've had horrible experiences, and that their existence is a kind of a response to their circumstance that has its own internal logic, even though we all pray it's not the internal logic that we would apply in a similar situation. Everybody loves to read about the characters who resist the Nazis in World War II. We're often less sympathetic or generous towards the very, very many people in Germany and in other places in the world, including the United States, including Canada, including the UK, who were sympathetic at the time to the Nazis. We just want to write them off as if they couldn't be us. But one of the things that I think some really great writers do is they make you feel some degree of empathy without making you think the other person's right. They make you go, okay, but I see the humanity there. Which sounds very highfalutin, given that I write books about, swashbuckling magistrates and talking squirrel cats.
And, vampire kangaroos.
Yes.
I swear it's my greatest invention ever. When I was having sort of marketing meetings with my publishers, we were like, so how are we going to market this? And they're just like, everyone was just like, vampire kangaroo. We'll do contests with you. When you pre-order the book, you get a vampire kangaroo print. That's this beautiful artwork that they had made. And the cover is going to have I remember when we were having a conversation about the cover, and they said, is there any way you could make him a dragon vampire kangaroo? And I said, no, but I'll make him, because you wouldn't have wings, but I'll make him one where he has blood wings, that once he's drunk enough blood, the sort of wings will spurt out, and it'll be disgusting. And so they were like, great, because that makes for a great cover. So yeah, that's really the key. That's the key for all your listeners who want to make it in the fantasy business. Come up with either murderous squirrel cats or vampire kangaroos.
That's solid advice.
Yeah.
Sebastien, I have to say, there's so much more that I feel like we could talk about. And I will ask you, will you please consider coming back on the podcast?
I would be delighted to. I've had a good time today, so thanks for having me on, and absolutely, I'm happy to come on again. Hopefully, it won't be from the depths of some kind of cancellation that's occurred in my career as a result of vampire kangaroos, but yeah, and then we can talk about giant werewolf koala sphinxes, because that's really where I think the next big hit's going to be. I'm
with you on this. I want to make sure our listeners know where to follow you. You have a website, decastell.com. That's DECASTELL.com. But where else would you like our listeners to come and support you and find your books?
Thank you for that. That's very kind of you. So yeah, the easiest place to connect with me is via my website at decastell.com. If you just Google Sebastien DeCastell, even if you don't spell it correctly, there's a decent chance you'll find me. The books are, in everywhere in the sort of, typical bookstores. They're published in 16 different languages around the world. Awesome. So, if you've been really craving a Hebrew edition of a young adult magical fantasy with a talking squirrel cat, you can have that.
Yes.
Or if your second language is Czech, or, French or German or whatever. And then in, the major bookstores and, Audible and all those sorts of the usual places. The latest book is Malevolent 8. You can read it without having read Malevolent 7, but I encourage everyone to buy 50 copies of each, because,
That's right.
Swords are expensive,
and support art.
There you go, support art. Well, don't buy 50 copies of mine. Buy one copy of mine and one copy of 49 other authors, and and then you'll be set for the year.
That is solid
Agreed.
advice. And if you run out of space on your bookshelves, buy another bookshelf.
There you go. Yeah, you can't
Books
have
don't
another
even.
bookshelf.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Books
No,
don't
go
even
ahead.
have to be on a bookshelf. They can pile up on the floor. There's no shame.
Books are the universal. So first of all, most people can't afford art anymore on the walls, and just getting cheap band posters and gluing them to your wall isn't cool anymore. So books are artwork, and yes, if you pile them on the floor and you're judicious about how you construct your piles, they become furniture. If all else fails, they become firewood. You can't go wrong with another book.
And you can display them nicely like you have in your background, so you could see all the covers as well, which I
Yeah,
love that. Nicely
thanks.
done.
Yeah, when I started, one of your commenters is saying no book burning.
Right.
Don't burn books for political reasons. Burn them only if you're very, very cold and there's no firewood around.
Right.
I just don't want anyone to freeze to death. But yeah, you have to. If you're going to have to burn your books for firewood, you must do so in an apolitical fashion. So
Correct.
You have to. That's the challenge. Yeah, so I do a lot of interviews, and for the longest time, every time I did an interview, I would constantly have to go and like clean up the back of my office so that it would look like something. And so eventually I thought, oh, well, I'll just put these shelves with just my books on them. But the problem is now I've had enough books published that I'm reaching a point where I'm like, I'm either going to have to, retire from being a novelist or build more shelves. And that's just a stressful decision.
What a problem to have.
It's true. It's what do they call it? High class problems. So yeah, that's my
right. It's a first world problem.
I'm reaching the point where they say we'd like a sequel to this novel, and I think I don't know. There's just not that much room on my shelf.
That's a good. We need more vampire kangaroos. I don't know. There's just not enough room on my shelf.
That's true. All right. Well, we'll just once we're up to Malevolent 19.
Right.
Then I'm putting my foot down. But I really appreciate the two of you having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been fantastic.
Thoroughly enjoyed this last hour. It's hard. I looked at the time and went, how is it possible we've gone through this much time? So that means it's definitely a great one. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I totally accept your duel. I expect a glove full of quarters being slapped in my face as soon as I step off the plane in Canada. We fight at dawn.
We fight at dawn. You choose the weapons. I'll choose the gloves.
Beautiful. It's a deal. As we close this episode out, please don't take anything we just said seriously.
I'm going to watch this happen.
Emily's going to be the one selling tickets.
I will also report back to our audiences what happens because someone has to.
And I will probably not be here because I'm fighting against an expert swordsman. And I'm not any of those things.
So join me, Sebastien DeCastell, next time on the Modern Romantic when I take Trey's spot. No,
he's just right. My new co-host Sebastian. For our next episode.
Well, for possibly the last time in my podcasting career, thank you so much for tuning into the Modern Romantic Podcast. You can find more behind-the-scenes content and other conversations you won't hear anywhere else on our Patreon. Just search for The Modrom on Patreon. You can find other episodes on our website, themodrom.com. But thank you so much for tuning in today, possibly for the last time for me. Have a great